I'm Jono Buchanan. Now I'm going to state the obvious. Mixes can become amazingly sophisticated things when we work with workstations. I'm old enough to remember when Logic was capable of only allowing you a certain number of tracks and no internal effects processing before the CPU started to sweat and groan and pass out. These days, we have an amazing capacity to put together software instruments, audio tracks, patterns, sequences, session players, you name it. We can add tracks of all different types to make amazingly sophisticated arrangements. And of course, for people who are working, let's say, in the multimedia space, you could even use Logic to balance multiple tracks of dialogue, effects, music, in order to basically create a mix for, let's say, a movie soundtrack, including all of the voices and all of the sound effects. A truly amazing program. But as things begin to become more sophisticated, it's helpful to know all of the ways in which it's possible to make life easier for yourself from a mixing perspective. Now, as you can see, and as you'll know if you watch this channel with any regularity, you'll know that I'm a bit of a sucker for colours. And part of the reason for that is because it makes it really easy for me in all of my projects to return, to open up a project that maybe I haven't looked at for 6 months and immediately see that the drums are blue and the bass is purple and the guitars are brown and the strings are green and I could keep going. Because in my head, it makes sense to have a colour palette which groups things together. And this idea of grouping sounds together is really useful as your mixes become sophisticated. And in this video, we're going to understand the differences between the ways in which Logic can group combinations of sounds together to make life straightforward. Now, actually, this goes back to a kind of hardware idea. We've all seen and sort of lusted over those 96-channel huge hardware consoles, which also keep your rooms nice and warm through winter. And of course, the thing about operating one of those enormous consoles is that you don't want to be saying to yourself, where's the tambourine on which track of this 96-channel mix? What you want to do over time is to make sure that, yes, the tambourine has its own channel, but that effectively it has been grouped together with the other drums so that you've got one fader to control the overall drum mix. And if you need to go and find the tambourine because it's too loud relative to everything else, fine, you can go and find its individual channel. But what happens when we think about mixes, and again, let's take that film example. We've got a sound effect on every single track, but what we want is all of that stuff to be controlled by a fader called sound effects. So if it turns out that relative to the volume of the music, the sound effects are too loud, and maybe the sound effects and the music are too loud relative to the voiceover, you've got amazingly simple little 3-dial control, which is sitting on the top of a much more sophisticated sub-mix of all of those instruments. Goodness me, that's a lot of talking. Let's have some music. Now then, let's start with groups. Now, what groups in Logic allow us to do is to put together a collection of sounds that are in common, drums, for instance, and then to have that group control various things about that collection of sounds. Let's set one up and I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to open up the mixer, and what I'm going to do is to select all of the sounds that make up the drum mix, which is here. And what you'll see is that above the automation routing and below the output routing, we have this currently off little panel which says group next to it. And what I'm going to do is to turn that on by clicking in the group area, and I'm going to create a new group. Now that's going to be automatically assigned to group number 1. So once I've done this, if I return to this panel, I'm going to discover that group 1 is assigned and group 2 is the next available one, but Logic offers us one per visit, if you like, to that little pane. So when I click that, what's going to happen is that the number 1 is going to be assigned to those tracks, and group 1 therefore is active. It's time for me to give it a name. I'm going to call it drums. And the moment I do that, we'll see that the kind of the little pane now tells us a little bit more, and immediately this is named after the sounds that are part of it. Now what I want is a little bit more screen space here. I'm going to close this down, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the settings for the groups instead. Now what I have a chance to do is to decide what it is that I want the groups to control. What do I want them to control? Now, there are lots of things that they could control, and by default, what I've got is automation mode, volume, and mute. Now, like I said, effectively think about groups as an administrative way of being able to look after a number of related types of sound at once. So for example, if what I wanted to do is to say, I want to record automation for each of the drum tracks, so therefore I'm going to go into latch mode. When I do that, it's going to do it for all of those tracks of that group, because automation is one of the active grouped controls. If I turn it back into read mode, they'll all change to read because this is on. Now, if I turn that off, and if I was to click out of here and simply select the kick drum, which is this first track, and I went into latch mode, I'll discover that only the first track goes into latch mode, because that is a parameter that is no longer grouped. It's only individually controlled now, rather than being a group control. Now, it turns out that one of the controls that I've got for the drums is volume. You can see that that is also controlled here. And in the context of us looking after our mix in a series of grouped ways, that is going to be significant, because what it means now is that if I touch any of the faders, any of the grouped sounds, they are all going to move. Now, before I do that, you can see that the volume faders for each of these tracks before I grouped them was slightly different. -2 for the kick drum, -4 for the snare and the clap, and then we've got a couple of loops within this project at -6 and -8. When I start moving these faders, the relative balance of all of these sounds is going to be maintained. So in other words, as I drop these down, all of them are going to move, but rather than moving to the same value, of course, they're going to maintain the relative relationship. So the great thing is that the drum mix will sound consistent. It's just all getting louder or quieter, depending on how I move any of these faders. So you can see that the volume of all of those things is changing relative to the other tracks, because that relationship, that volume relationship, is being preserved. And of course, the reason why the light has gone red here is because the output light has gone red here is because we were starting at -2. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's fine, but if in adjusting the grouped volumes like that, I suddenly discovered that one of my loops was too loud, I obviously can't come to that track and adjust its volume, because all of them are going to be adjusted. So what I can do is simply temporarily turn off that group here. You can see it will grey out, and then I'm in a position to say, actually, you know what, this loop is too loud, or indeed it might be too quiet, in which case I might turn it up a little bit, and then I can re-engage that group, and that new volume relationship is going to be preserved. Now, there are a number of things about groups, and depending on how you've come to Logic, it could be that you've come from GarageBand, it could be that Logic's the first program you've ever worked with, but if you're an Ableton Live user, or if you've come from Pro Tools, groups mean slightly different things, and that term, group, as its name suggests, means a collection of things which you can see as one together, but the way that they behave is slightly different. Do I use groups to control volume of instruments like this within Logic? Personally, no, I don't. I do use groups if I've got a multi-track arrangement of strings or drums, and what I want to do is to edit those together. So in other words, if everything is audio based, I would absolutely assign things into a group, and I would press the editing button, and the reason for that becomes clear when I click on any of these tracks. Immediately they're all going to be highlighted, because by selecting one, I'm selecting them all. Remember, they're a group. And then what I can do is to come to the scissors tool and say, you know what, I want a little bar off at bar 8. I'm going to chop at that point. I'm then going to mute it, and immediately all of those things are edited together. I definitely use groups for editing. For volume control, no, I don't do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo that mute. In fact, I might undo both of those stages, so we're back to where we started. And what I'm then going to do is I'm going to turn off this group, and we're going to pretend it never happened. So that is nevertheless one way of us being able to work with groups of sounds and collections of sounds. So going back to that question, how would I do that? Well, of course, we've got the track stack. Now, not that long ago, in fact, using this particular piece of music, I've done a big video about track stacks and nested track stacks, ways of being able to see sounds in groups, collections of sounds, and then to see little sub-mixes within those too. So do go and watch that if you haven't already. But what I am going to do at this stage is I'm going to put my mix into 3 separate faders. This one is going to be the drums. This is a summing stack, and it's now going to control all of the drum mix. I'm going to fold it down. I think I said 3 faders, but I mean 4. What I'm then going to do is again to use a summing stack, and I'm going to put the bass into this track. And yes, there is only 1 track that is in that summing stack, but I'm still going to do it. These 2 tracks are going to be my guitars, and we're going to just label those up as well. And then lastly, what we'll have as we fold that one down is the pianos. And it doesn't matter that one of those is electric and one of them is sort of upright. They are still pianos in my book. Now, the advantage of this becomes clear. This takes us back to sitting in front of a 96-channel console. I've now got my mix on 4 separate faders. If I open up the mix, what I've got a chance to do is to say, you know what, the pianos are too loud relative to everything else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn them down by 2 decibels. And now suddenly my mix really straightforwardly is folded down into 4 separate stacks. Amazingly useful if what you're doing is building a huge orchestral arrangement and what you want to do is to separate your short strings from your long strings, from your woodwinds, from your brass, from your percussion. 5 separate tracks, and suddenly there is your whole mix. And of course, even if your track stacks run to 16 tracks, underneath that there may be 100 tracks that have been organized into that group. And even now I can see that the drums account for tracks 1 through to 6, bass is clearly number 7, the guitars make up tracks 9 through to 12, which is where the pianos take over. So these little numbers down the left-hand side are showing me the new track number. And obviously within those, if I just fold these down, I get to see what all of the intervening tracks are. So track 2 is the kick, 3 is the snare, 6 is the last of the loops before 7 becomes the track stack for the bass. So of course I can make things as sophisticated as I want by opening these up, or indeed folding them down if what I want to do is processing like that. Okay, now let's look at why that might be advantageous from an actual mixing perspective. What I'm going to do is on the drums, I'm going to put an auto filter. I want the drums to filter up. And what I'm going to do on the track stack is open up the automation, come into the auto filter and come and find the cutoff frequency. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a point at bar 5 where I want the cutoff frequency to be at full 100%. And to start with, it's going to start at around 35. For the drums, that means this. And by the time we get to bar 5, everything is at full frequency. Okay, that's fine. So what I've got now is a little bit of automation on that track. Now I might decide that because of the fact that that's filtering up, it all feels a little bit quiet at the beginning. So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to create a volume ramp, which starts above 0 and just fades down to 0 by bar 5. Only a couple of dB, but nevertheless, what I've now got is a little bit of volume automation now on that track as well. Let's listen to the whole mix. Okay, I'm going to do a couple of other things with volume as well. This little wah-wah guitar part, what I'm going to do here is to say, actually, you know what, that also feels a little bit loud. I'm going to come to the volume for that particular part too, and I'm just going to make sure that this one is fading up, so as the drums come up, that one's staying out of the way a little bit more. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to turn all of the pianos down. They feel a little bit loud in this opening section. They're kind of getting in the way a little bit of this murky start that the drums are producing. In other words, what I'm starting to do now is to balance my mix, not just in a static way with my 4 faders on my track stacks, but now I'm adding automation data as well. And what that means is I've got a little bit of extra sophistication in terms of the volume of the way that these things are sounding. Okay, so my new mix sounds like this. And having made that change, it definitely feels to be like probably overall the bass could be louder at the beginning until everything else comes in. Let's give that a little bit of a volume push too. Okay, now let's suppose for a moment that this is my entire piece of music, the whole thing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to print this mix and I'm going to send it to whomever, the person that I'm collaborating with, a music publisher, whoever it is that's expecting this piece of music. I'm going to print this, I'm going to send it off to them. And let's suppose they come back and say, yep, I want everything to be quieter relative to the drums. The drums are fine, but I want them to feel like they're bigger than everything else right now. Relative to the drums, the bass and the guitars and the pianos are too loud. Okay, no problem. So in other words, the drums are fine, but everything else needs to be quieter. Fine. The only thing is, with that, I've now added automation data controlling volume to the bass. I haven't done anything, I don't think, to the guitars from a track stack perspective, so they're kind of fine and easy to change from a volume perspective. But the pianos, okay, they also have volume data. Now the temptation would be to slightly forget that. I could close all of the automation data down, and what I could say is, okay, let's suppose this client or the person that I'm working with wants the drums to be 2 decibels louder than everything else is right now. Well, I could drop the volume of the bass by 2 dB, and I could drop the volume of the guitars by 2 dB, and the pianos by 2 dB, and they'd all have come down, and the drums would be the same volume, so relatively speaking, they'd be louder. But the only problem is that I can't just turn that fader down by 2 decibels now. If I do that, okay, that's an easy bit of maths. That's going to leave me at 0.4. The moment I press play, it's going to jump back up to 2.4 because of course the automation is controlling that. So I've either got to go through and change the automation data for the bass and for the pianos, but remember that I don't need to change it for the guitars because there isn't any, or what I need to do is to find another way of being able to control the relative mix of the bass and the guitars and the pianos, but to leave the drums exactly where they are. Make sense? I hope so. The way that I'm going to do that is by using what's referred to as a VCA fader. So we've looked at groups, we've looked at track stacks, and now what we're going to do is to look at a third way that we can control groups of tracks and their volume. And to make life straightforward, once again, what I'm going to do is to fold all of my mix down to just the track stacks, and I'm going to turn automation off. Okay, so now we've got a straightforward way of being able to view our mix. I'm going to come into the mixer page, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the bass track stack and the guitars track stack and the pianos track stack. And what I'm now going to do is to control click, and I'm going to create a new VCA fader. Now this produces a brand new type of track for my mixer, and it's over here. It's called VCA1. It's not the most helpful name, but I'm going to just call it, I don't know, pitched instruments. And now I'm going to remember that that is a different name to the drums. Now I can't actually see that very clearly because I've only got one line of text here. We can change that too. I can control click, and what I can do is to come in to configure channel strip components if I want to. And I'm going to take one line up to 3, and now we can see the name that I've assigned to that VCA. So what does a VCA fader actually do? Well, what it does is it controls the volume of whatever you have routed into that VCA. In other words, if I wanted everything to be 2 decibels quieter, I could just simply turn this VCA down by 2 dB. And that is going to take 2 decibels off all of the tracks that have been routed to that VCA. Not the drums, but everything else is. So what you can hear as I solo that channel is the drums drop out because they're not part of the VCA. You can hear that as I pull the volume down, the drums stay the same volume, but everything else gets quieter. And if I push it louder, well, you know where I'm going with that. Effectively, my VCA fader is controlling the volume of those things. Now, when do VCAs become particularly useful? Okay, again, suppose you're a multimedia composer and someone has sent you a film to work on and there is a voiceover on that track. And suddenly someone, when you send the film back, says, I can't hear the voiceover properly. Can you turn down all of the music relative to the voiceover? Okay, well, imagine you've got volume automation data on all of your track stacks. Let's suppose it's a big orchestral cue using strings and winds and brass and loads of other instruments as well. And suddenly you think, oh no, this is going to be a nightmare. I've got to go in to all of my tracks, all of the automation data. I've got to pull everything down by 5 dB. No, you don't. You can just assign all of those track stacks to one VCA, pull it down by 5 dB, and you're away. You've basically rebalanced your mix. You just leave the voiceover track out of that VCA routing. Here's another example. Let's suppose you've composed, I don't know, a brilliant song and you send it in to someone and they say, you know what, the vocals feel like they're a bit too quiet. Not just the lead vocal, but all of the backing vocals too. Could you turn them up? Well, you might be thinking, well, I could just turn everything else down. Again, take all of the other instruments that aren't the vocals, assign them to a VCA fader, pull their volume down. So within this episode, what we've done is to look at groups, ways of being able to put together groups of sounds for editing, for muting, for automation modes, and it turns out that there is also the option for volume to be controlled that way too. If you like working with groups, absolutely you can control volume of a number of tracks at the same time. We've then looked at summing stacks within Logic, the idea that we can take groups of sounds, assign them to a summing stack, and there we can automate volume. We can also control volume of groups of instruments relative to other ones. Great. And now what we've also done is to look at a VCA fader. Ways of being able to take entire track stacks, group them together again if we want to, so that we can again make another round of volume adjustments of a particular group of instruments relative to another one. As I said earlier in the video, if the track stack element of that is one that you find particularly useful, do go and watch both of the videos that we've made about track stacks and nested track stacks. But hopefully now you've got an idea of the sophistication that mixes can take on. And by the way, don't panic about that. Remember, this is just going to be a series of steps that you take when you're at that moment. Ask yourself the question, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? And now you've got 3 separate strategies for working out which one best suits whatever it is that you want to do next. Go and have fun with it. Don't be intimidated.